Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. This time I'm going to be reviewing and discussing books by Edgar Snow. Edgar Snow was an American journalist. The majority of his books are about China, but he also wrote several about the Soviet Union. His most famous book by far is Red Star over China. In the past I already made a video where I reviewed all the books by historian J.R. Getty, and I think this is something I want to keep doing. I'm gonna read various books by various historians and people like that and then comment on them. I'm especially interested in the Soviet Union, obviously, but also socialist countries in general. But anyway, let's get right into it. So I'm gonna be talking about these books in chronological order. Don't know how long it's gonna take, because Snow wrote a lot of books. I guess first I should say something about Edgar Snow himself. He's not a communist writer, although a lot of communists do read his books. Edgar Snow was basically a liberal, I would say. He was definitely not a Marxist. He always said that he doesn't support Marxism. However, he was pretty progressive, like he was very much against fascism, was very much against militarism. He wanted peaceful relations between his home country, which was the United States, and the Soviet Union and China, so he didn't like the Cold War. He had a particular fascination with China. In several of his books, I think Journey to the Beginning, and I think in Scorched Earth, although it also could have been People on Our Side, but I think it was Scorched Earth, Edgar Snow does say that he basically wants some kind of socialism or some kind of planned economy, because he thought that that was just the future of mankind. He thought that this chaotic, free market, capitalist type of economy just didn't have a future. And the reason that he comes to that conclusion is that he sees that socialism and planned economy is becoming more and more influential. He sees the Soviet Union become a very powerful industrial country. He sees the Eastern European people's democracies start to implement planned economy. He sees China implement planned economy. And he also spent a lot of time in India talking to people like Nehru. And Nehru also sort of described himself as some kind of socialist, and also said that there should be like public ownership of at least the most important sectors of the economy or the economic heights, and that there should be some kind of planned economy. So generally in democratic and progressive circles, socialism and planned economy was widespread. I would say Edgar Snow's politics, they seem kind of similar to like Fabianism or the views of like H.G. Wells, people like that. Although, of course, he wasn't really a politician or a political activist. That wasn't really what he was doing. He usually wasn't really advocating for policy. He just mentions it in passing in a couple places that he thinks that planned economy seems to be the future. I would say the only two policies that he actually explicitly advocates on numerous occasions are fighting against fascism and peaceful relations with the Soviet Union. But the way he talks about peaceful relations with the Soviet Union, for instance, in books such as Stalin Must Have Peace, he's not saying the Soviets are correct and the US is wrong, the US must accept like the Soviet position. No, instead he's saying that the Soviets, they should see that the US really isn't so bad, and the US should see that the Soviets really aren't so bad, and they should come to an agreement. It's that type of thing. But I'll talk about that more when we actually get to discussing that particular book. But my point is that Snow is a very sort of kind of balanced person. I guess in Marxist terms you could say that he's like petit bourgeois. Because he's not really a socialist. I mean, he's certainly not a Marxist or a communist. But he's also not the biggest fan of capitalism, and he's certainly a progressive rather than a reactionary. But anyway, let's finally get to the books themselves. I have read all of his books, including the two which he didn't complete, and also the one that he didn't write but he only edited. I've read all of them. The only one that I did not read is his first book, Far Eastern Front, published in 1933. And the reason I didn't read that is because I was not able to find it anywhere. If somebody knows where I could get it, then please let me know. It would be very cool to be able to read it. However, in his autobiography, Journey to the Beginning, he talks about the Far Eastern Front. So even though I wasn't able to read it, I was able to get an idea of what it was about. It's about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So Edgar Snow, he studies advertising, which to me sounds like the most boring, most horrible job ever, but he wants to get into advertising, so he studies that. But he also wants to travel around the world, and he goes to China, and then he decides that he wants to be like a travel writer. So he wants to write about exotic locations, because that was popular at the time. He was reading other people who were writing those kinds of things. So he wants to travel around China, and he wants to write a book, I think, called South of the Clouds. But in the middle of his travels, Japan invades Manchuria. And Edgar Snow starts to think that this could be the beginning of a new world war. And then he also sees that there is a lot of political turmoil in China itself. Obviously, China is a semi-colonial country. China is not only a British colony, but it's basically the colony of all the Western colonial powers. Britain owns Hong Kong, but in cities like Shanghai, all the colonial powers like France, UK, even Belgium, they all have their own sections of the city that they control, and the Chinese are not allowed to go there. And China has had its own revolution against feudalism and for national independence led by Sun Yat-sen. A communist party has emerged in China. The communists used to be in the same party with Sun Yat-sen, the Kuomintang party, but after Sun Yat-sen dies, a person named Chiang Kai-shek takes over the Kuomintang, and then he turns out to be a reactionary, so he attacks the communists. The communists then try to overthrow him, and that leads to a very protracted civil war. And at the same time, Japan then invades Manchuria, and then the Kuomintang refuses to do anything to resist Japan. They just make all these concessions to Japan, which then makes the Chinese population very upset. And then there's this anti-Japanese patriotic resistance movement that starts to appear, etc., etc. So there's a lot of stuff going on in China. So Edgar Snow just sort of finds himself in the middle of all this. And then he doesn't just become a travel writer, he becomes a journalist who writes about these kinds of things. After the Far Eastern Front, Snow releases a book called Living China, Modern Chinese Short Stories in 1936. And this book you can find, for example, on Internet Archive. I can put a link in the description so you can read it. This book is different from his other books because he didn't actually write this, he only edited it. It's a collection of short stories. And the reason that he wanted to make a book like that is because of how it relates to the political situation in China at the time. In the introduction he says that the modern short story is something very new in China, and that it was basically started by this guy named Lu Xun. He's a Chinese critical realist author, a classic of Chinese literature, and he was the head of the League of Left-Wing Writers, which was founded in 1930 on the initiative of the Chinese Communist Party. And this book, it's an example of, what the modern Chinese literary scene is like. What are some of the examples of the best stories and the best authors and whatnot? You'll notice all these writers, they're progressives, they're anti-imperialists, many of them are communists. They were members of the League of Left-Wing Writers until it was dismantled and banned by the Kuomintang the same year that this book was published. So this book was actually published as a response to the Kuomintang, because the Kuomintang started to persecute all progressive, democratic, anti-fascist, anti-imperialist, socialist and communist people. And this book gives these biographical descriptions of each of these writers, and it states that some of them were imprisoned by the Kuomintang, some of them were killed by the Kuomintang, some of them were just silenced by the Kuomintang. And these writers, they all represent this new literary trend, which is leftist, political, and realist. Many of them explicitly said that literature is political and that literature needs to talk about contemporary political issues, such as the massive inequality and poverty in China, colonialism, feudalism, slavery, the Civil War, etc., etc. So I actually recommend this book highly. Some of these writers are better than others. Some of them wrote good stuff earlier and then not so good stuff later. I can't really go into that here, but I recommend it, and it's very cool that they published a book like this. Now, we move to his next book. His most famous book by far, Red Star over China, published the next year, so in 1937. and expanded 2 years later in 1939. Red Star over China is Edgar Snow telling about the time that he spent with the Chinese communist rebels. So it starts with him getting into contact with the communist underground, and then being able to travel to the red territory, places where the communists have their red base areas. And what can I even say about this book? It's so extensive. It talks about everything. It basically gives a history of the Communist Party up to that point, which is obviously very useful, but it's also very interesting because this was published in 1937, so it's published and written from the point of view of not only before the Communist Party came to power, but it's even written before the Second World War even started. But it's still remarkably accurate. Just from reading this, you might think that this was written in like 1950 or something. Because from the book, you really get the impression that the war with Japan is already going like full blast. So the Second World War is already basically going on in China, even though it hasn't started in Europe yet. And maybe it's just me, but in my opinion, from the book you get a strong impression that the communists are gonna win. So the book, it just talks about the conditions in semi-feudal, semi-colonial China, how the conditions are bad, why the Communist Party was created, why people are joining it, why the peasants support it, what kind of policies the communists have implemented in the areas they control, such as land reform, equality between men and women, democratic reform, social programs, organizing the people for armed struggle. Snow describes the communist movement as a ideological crusade or like a propaganda crusade, by which he means that the communists, they just go into like some village, they just arrive there, and then they immediately start like talking to the people, and they start to organize them. So they get rid of the landlords, they tell the people, okay, the landlord has been exploiting you, so now we're gonna overthrow him. The people put the landlord on trial, the people criticize the landlord, the people criticize the local gentry, the people criticize the oppressors, they organize the women to fight for their rights, they start teaching people about communist policies, about communist ideology, about the policies and ideas of the anti-Japanese United Front, etc., etc. The book really demonstrates the power of ideas, the fact that Marxism has powerful ideas, that in China at that time, the policies and the ideas of Marxism-Leninism and the policies and ideas of the Chinese Communist Party really resonated with people, and that the communists were able to see what the local conditions were and then apply Marxism to those conditions. But obviously, the story of the Chinese Civil War, even up to that point, is a long and complicated story, and if you want to learn the story, then I think you should just read the book. This book is also highly recommended. I would say this is definitely Edgar Snow's best book. I can't really praise it highly enough. It has tons of really interesting little details in it. It's just generally an overall really good book. It gives you such a good overview of what the Chinese communists are all about, how their movement evolved and spread, and what kind of policies they were doing. It's also considered a classic of history writing because it was basically the first book of its kind. Nobody else had really gone to see what the communists were actually doing. Nobody else had really researched the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese Communist movement. Nobody else knew the facts about them. When Snow went to write this book, the Kuomintang had been trying to exterminate the communist movement for years, and the Kuomintang called each of their general offensives against the communists extermination drives or anti-red extermination drives. And their latest attempt was that because they couldn't defeat the communists in battle because the communists were using guerrilla tactics, instead the Kuomintang imposed a blockade on the red territories. So they tried to prevent any resources from getting to the communists, and they wanted to just slowly advance and slowly surround them and suffocate them. And also they imposed a complete propaganda and media blockade. So nobody could get any information from what the communists were actually doing. And the Kuomintang were just lying about them. The Kuomintang were just saying that the communists, they're just criminals, they're just bandits, they don't have an ideology, they're just robbers. or that the communists are all dead, that the Communist Party is dissolved, because nobody knew who those people even were. They just knew that there's these guys like Mao Zedong, Chu Te, Zhou Enlai, but nobody knew anything about them. So this book is still considered a classic and pretty much a primary source because it's the first place where we actually get some kind of rough biography of Mao and also some of the other communist leaders, because Mao eventually agrees to give this long interview to Edgar Snow. So great book, highly recommended. I would say it's a must read. That said, Edgar Snow was not a communist, he was not a Marxist. He tried to understand Marxism, but he doesn't quite understand it. He certainly doesn't think like a Marxist. He's certainly not following any kind of Marxist party line or whatever. He's not following a Marxist interpretation of history. So he gets some things wrong. There's some stuff that he says that I don't agree with, but they're all pretty small things. And in this case, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we have some communist sources that talk about this, and I think it is useful to also have a non-communist source talking about this, especially when it's a source as good as this. Alright, next one, Scorched Earth, published in the US as The Battle for Asia, 1941. This one is also really good. It talks about the war between China and Japan. It's not written from the point of view of the communists, although it does talk about the communists as well, but it's mostly written from the point of view of the Chinese government. In this book, Snow is not really in the red territories, he's in other parts of China. He's talking about the battles between the Chinese government of the Kuomintang and Japan, and he's talking about the fact that the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek, or the so-called Nanking government, wasn't really doing a whole lot to resist Japan. They hadn't prepared for war to resist Japan. Chiang Kai-shek's whole military policy was kind of ridiculous, like how he bought a bunch of airplanes from other countries to create like this air fleet, but then he didn't build any kind of industry that could actually fuel or supply this air fleet. He talks about how the Western countries reacted to the Japanese invasion of China, how British capitalists, for instance, thought that it was fine that Japan was doing this. They didn't really care. Actually, a lot of the Western powers thought that it was kind of good that Japan was intervening to stop the Chinese Revolution. So the Western powers didn't really see Japan as a threat, nor did the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang government of Chiang Kai-shek wanted to make compromises to Japan and concessions to Japan, and they wanted to focus on eradicating the communists. And for example, part 3 of the book is called Japan Eradicates Communism, where it talks about how Japan also wants to prioritize destroying communism, and they want to tell people that we're actually just intervening because we want to help China defeat communism. I also think that it was in this book where Edgar Snow talks to Sun Yat-sen's widow the most, which was pretty cool because Sun Yat-sen obviously was the leader of the Chinese National Democratic Revolution, which obviously didn't entirely succeed, and Sun Yat-sen was also the founder of the Kuomintang, and as a result, after Sun Yat-sen died, there was an ideological battle in China over who gets to claim the legacy of the Kuomintang. Chiang Kai-shek obviously took over the Kuomintang, but he also changed all the policies. So he claimed that he represents the Kuomintang and he gets the credit for the legacy of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, while the communists were saying that, no, we are the real followers of Dr. Sun Yat-sen because we're actually following his policies. And Dr. Sun Yat-sen's widow certainly agreed with the communists. She did not like Chiang Kai-shek one bit. So this one, Scorched Earth, also known as The Battle for Asia, is highly recommended. It's very good, very useful if you want to know about this topic. It's not as essential as Red Star over China, because Red Star over China is really a history of Chinese communism, whereas Scorched Earth is just about the war. It's not really about communism, although of course communism is involved. Okay, next up we have People on Our Side, published in 1944. This one is very interesting. It talks about a number of different countries and how they relate to the Second World War, and as the name implies, as the title implies, People on Our Side, It talks about countries that are on the side of the United Nations against the Axis powers. So it starts with India, and it's talking about the stuff that's going on in India, the Indian independence movement. It talks about Gandhi, it talks about Nehru. And I'm not really an expert on India, but I think the communist view has always been that Gandhi really wasn't all that great. He was really trying to prevent any kind of social revolution. He wanted independence and he wanted minimal reform, but that's it. Whereas Edgar Snow has an extremely positive view of Gandhi, which certainly separates him from the Marxists. But nonetheless, what he has to say about India is still very interesting. He's describing the conditions in India, and he's also talking about China and Burma. And the thing that he emphasizes the most is that the people of India don't like the British. The British colonizers have been oppressing India. They've subjugated India, they've exploited India for all this time, and as a result, all the people of India want to do is get rid of the British. But the British, they are at war with the Axis, they're at war with Germany, and they're trying to get the people of India to support the anti-fascist war. But the people of India, they see Britain as the main threat. Now, obviously, there were plenty of people in India who wanted to fight fascism and who didn't like fascism and who were serious anti-fascists. But it really seems that the main bulk of the population was kind of torn. They didn't really know. On the one hand, they didn't like fascism, but then on the other hand, they also really didn't like the British. So they're in this tough situation where they think, okay, now the war is going on, so Britain is desperate, so now we should push for independence. Whereas Britain is saying, no, you need to help us defeat Hitler first, and then we'll talk about the independence. We don't have time to fight amongst ourselves when we have to be fighting Hitler. But obviously the people of India, they will see that as potentially a trick, because they think, oh, well, they just want us to help them, and then once they've defeated Hitler, they've consolidated their power again, and then they're not going to give us independence anyway. And Edgar Snow is very annoyed at this situation, because he definitely wants everybody to fight against fascism. And his biggest gripe against Gandhi is that Gandhi says that they don't want to fight fascism. They don't care about fascism. They're not anti-fascist. Gandhi doesn't see fascism as a threat, and the anti-fascists were saying that, well, Japan could invade all of China, or they could invade other countries too, like even India. But Gandhi didn't see that as a threat. He thought, well, Japanese colonialism, how bad could it be? Like, we already have British colonialism. So the biggest point that Edgar Snow wants to make is that the fact that Britain is an imperialist country, the fact that it's a colonial empire, is seriously hindering the anti-fascist struggle. They can't rally the masses behind them, because the masses see that Britain is an imperialist power. It's an anti-people power. It's not on the side of the people. In part 2 of the book, Edgar Snow goes to the Soviet Union. So he had this whole plan of how he wanted to go around the world. He wanted to go to China, to India, Russia, a bunch of other places. So he finally gets to go to the USSR. And this section of the book, I think, is really good. So he's talking about how the war is going. He's talking about how everybody in the USSR is on board with the anti-fascist war. Everybody is contributing. Morale is very high. Everybody wants to save their country. Everybody wants to defeat Hitler. He interviews a bunch of people who were liberated from under the Nazi yoke. So there were plenty of territories that the Nazis occupied, but then the Nazis obviously were defeated. So he interviews people from those territories and asks them, well, how was it? And the people tell about their experiences. And they talk about the Nazi policies. And sometimes you hear from these insane reactionaries that, oh, the people of the Soviet Union or the people of Soviet Ukraine or whatever, they saw the Nazis as liberators. They cheered when the Nazis arrived, and they were so happy when the Nazis arrived. Well, this book really debunks that. It explains that the Nazis, they were so racist and they were so arrogant because they thought that they would win the war easily, so they didn't bother to try to win over the occupied peoples. They just invade the Soviet Union, and instantly they just steal everything, kill everybody, destroy everything, start sending everybody into slavery. So they couldn't get the people on their side. Even the people who were anti-communist thought that the Nazis are far, far worse. Now, later, of course, the Nazis, they tried to create the Russian Nazi army under Vlasov, but that also didn't really work. And this book says something that other books have also corroborated, which is that the only Nazi policy that kind of worked was that they were able to spread anti-Semitism. So the people who the Nazis occupied, they didn't like any of the Nazi policies, but some of the Nazi anti-Semitic brainwashing kind of got to some of them. So thanks. They were able to make the people a little bit more reactionary, a little bit stupider, but they didn't do anything to improve the lives of the people. And when it comes to the Soviet Union, Edgar Snow doesn't really agree with the ideology of the Soviet Union, but he's impressed about the unity of the people, about the people's high morale, how everybody in the rear is also working really hard for the war effort. He's impressed at how effective the war economy is. I think this is perhaps the first time when he becomes very impressed with planned economy. Although when he was in China, he was organizing something called the Chinese Industrial Cooperatives, which was basically a movement. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a movement of cooperative enterprises that he helped to create because China didn't have any industry. They had a little bit of industry in the big cities, but then Japan captured all the big cities, so then China literally had nothing. They didn't have any industry anymore. So to facilitate the war effort, they had to try to create something. So they started these industrial cooperatives. So Edgar Snow already was, he was aware that cooperative workplaces could work. But when he goes to the Soviet Union, he's very impressed with the planned economy and how it's able to sustain the war effort. His biggest point, and I would say the biggest point of this whole book, the reason why this book is divided into two parts. The first part deals with India and China, and it's called Brown Bondage. And the second part is called Days of Victory, and it talks about the Soviet Union. Is that he was going around in Uzbekistan and Transcaucasia, and he was interviewing people there, and he was seeing how the conditions were. And he became convinced that the Soviet Union and Great Britain had completely the opposite policy when it came to oppressed nationalities. So he became convinced that the Soviet Union actually liberated their oppressed nationalities, such as Uzbeks and Georgians and what have you. He talks about the huge economic and cultural advancements in Uzbekistan, for instance, in the Soviet Union, and also in the Mongolian People's Republic. And he also mentions the fact that while all the Western powers, they tried to continue to oppress China, but the only country that treated China fairly was the USSR. The Russian Empire, they had a military base in Port Arthur in China, and they also had the Chinese Eastern Railway, which the Russian Empire had constructed in the late 1800s and early 1900s in northeastern China, in Manchuria. But the Soviet Union gave up all their claims to China. They made a fair agreement with the Chinese about the use of the railway. So Edgar Snow states that the Western imperialist powers, they need to treat the oppressed nationalities fairly. They need to give them independence. They need to liberate them. And then they will willingly join with the Allies to fight against fascism. Because that's what the Soviets have done. And as a result, all the nationalities of the Soviet Union, the Uzbeks, the Georgians, the Tajiks, the people of Azerbaijan, they're all united behind the Soviet government. And there's so many little interesting things in this book, like Edgar Snow interviews a German prisoner of war and asks the German guy, well, what's your opinion? How do you see this situation? And, well, what do you think the German guy says? It's all very interesting. So this book also is highly recommended. I think the section on the USSR is much better than the section on India. And this is not an absolute must-read, but it's good. Next one. This is from the following year. This is from 1945. This is called The Pattern of Soviet Power. So this one I've seen cited quite a lot in a bunch of history books. And it's talking about how the Soviet Union is after it has won the Second World War. And it's also talking about Eastern European countries, how the Soviet Union has acted towards Eastern European countries. It talks about Romania, Poland, Ukraine, also about Germany, Japan, and China. And this book I would highly recommend. It's really good in my opinion, especially the segment on Poland and Romania I think are great. But in this book, there's a couple weird things, like it becomes so evident that he's not a Marxist. He really doesn't understand Soviet policies. The thing about Edgar Snow is that when he's just traveling around like China or the USSR and he's just documenting what's happening, that's good. But then when he's trying to analyze policies, he sometimes doesn't get it. He sometimes gets it wrong. Except on China. Like, on China, he was somehow spot on. But then again, he wasn't really saying anything all that original. Like, he was saying what the communists had already said previously, so he was convinced that the communists were correct about the need to resist Japan and whatnot, about the need for land reform and democratic reform and all that. But for instance, in this book, he talks about how he thinks that the Soviet Union has become like more conservative or something like that. He says that the Soviet Union definitely is not abandoning Marxism, that anybody who thinks that the USSR has stopped being Marxist is just wrong. But the Soviet Union implemented a bunch of new policies. They emphasized and studied Russian history a lot more, and not only Russian, but also the history of all the other Soviet nationalities. For instance, they made a bunch of movies about Uzbek history, although perhaps Snow wasn't aware of that. But in any case, he thinks that the Soviet Union has now become more nationalistic, or that they've somehow returned to the Tsarist past, except in a communist form. And maybe like the biggest example of that he comes up with is the Suvorov School. The USSR created like this elite military academy called the Suvorov Academy. And Suvorov obviously was a pre-revolutionary general. So then Edgar Snow and also a bunch of other people, they conclude, oh look, the Soviets, they are promoting Suvorov. That must mean that they're like the Tsar now, or something. Or that they've at least appropriated the Tsarist aesthetic or something. He's saying that the soldiers have these fancy uniforms again. They're talking about Suvorov. They're talking about Russian military victories of previous times. But it's all kinda sort of misguided and one-sided. Like, first of all, these movies, for instance, that talk about Russian pre-revolutionary history, such as the Suvorov movie, came out in 1941, before the war started. And if you watch that movie, it's not a conservative movie at all. It's all about Suvorov being a very revolutionary and innovative general who was persecuted by the Tsar as a result. And that Suvorov just wants to defend the national interest, while the Tsar is not fighting for the national interest. Or if you watch, I would say, other similar movies like maybe Peter the Great, that's a 2-part Soviet movie, and that movie is about the fact that Peter the Great was trying to modernize and industrialize Russia, and that first Russia gets its ass kicked by Sweden, but then they modernize and industrialize and then they win. And of course, the Soviets had a bunch of critiques and criticisms of Peter I. Stalin famously said that Peter I was, of course, only looking out for the interest of the merchants and landowners, and that he was trying to create a powerful sort of embryonic bourgeois landowner state. But you clearly see what the point of the movie is. They didn't have industry, they lost. They built industry, they won. That's a movie about a pre-revolutionary leader, but it's not a conservative movie in any way. It's not saying, oh yeah, we need to go back to doing things the way they were. If anything, I've noticed that Russian conservatives really don't like Peter I because they think that Peter I is too modern. That's a whole different topic. Can't really go into that, otherwise we'll be here all day. Besides the nationalism thing, he's talking about the Soviet marriage reform, education reform a little bit, and he sees those things as somewhat conservative, but they're really not. The other really big topic is the topic of religion. So Edgar Snow talks about how religion in the Soviet Union has now entered a new stage, where basically the church is no longer seen as such an enemy. The government now handles the church much more leniently, because when the war started, the Russian Orthodox Church immediately said that they support the Soviet government's war effort, and that they oppose fascism, and that they want to rally everybody against Hitler. So the Church proved its loyalty to the Soviet power, and as a result, the Soviet power no longer attacked the Church in the same way. They still carried out ideological struggle against religion, they still advocated atheism and materialism and the scientific worldview, and they still said that communists need to be atheists, but they didn't need to attack the Church as an organization anymore in the same way that they had done in the past. Because in the past, the clergy had been a pillar of Tsarism, but now that wasn't the case anymore. And as a result, ultra-reactionaries like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for instance, he opposed the Russian Orthodox Church because he said that the Orthodox Church doesn't fight against the Soviet government, therefore the Orthodox Church has sold out, and that reactionaries need to support only anti-Soviet forms of Christianity. The section about religion is interesting reading, but unfortunately, Edgar Snow doesn't really fully understand what's going on. He thinks that the government is making some kind of compromise with the Church, but that's not at all what's happening. Instead, the Church is just making concessions to the government. The Church is proving its loyalty to the government instead of the government making some kind of appeasement to the Church. There's a bunch of interesting little details, like how the communists are helping to rebuild damaged churches as museums or as historical relics, and Snow thinks that that's just an excuse, that they're just covertly opening churches. Of course they were opening churches, and they did allow people to have churches, but after the Second World War, the Soviet view also was that they needed to protect historical buildings, and they needed to even build new buildings in more of a historical style, so that they could retain the sense of an old, established national culture with a rich history, because the future is built, obviously, from elements of the past. They wanted to retain positive elements of the past and discard the outdated and negative elements. And restoring old buildings was particularly important after the war, because so many buildings had been destroyed, so that they were seriously concerned that what if all the old buildings are just destroyed, and then we will lose all of our tradition in terms of architecture. In chapter 12, there's a section called Criticism, and I think that's a pretty neat little section. It talks about how much criticism there is in the USSR, that it's not this state where nobody's allowed to criticize anything. Instead, there's a ton of criticism, and that if there wasn't any criticism, then the society couldn't function. But again, it's blatantly evident that Snow is a liberal and not a Marxist. For instance, he constantly says that Stalin is a dictator, that the USSR doesn't have democracy, etc., etc. He says that it's a very developed and functioning society, but he still says that they don't have democracy and that he doesn't agree with the Soviet system. But nonetheless, Pattern of Soviet Power, I strongly recommend it, although I have a bunch of gripes with it. Alright, moving right along. 2 years later, Edgar Snow published another book called Stalin Must Have Peace. This was his attempt to affect world politics. He wanted to facilitate some kind of mutual understanding between the USSR and the USA. He said that America is misunderstanding what the Soviets are doing, and that the Soviets also are misunderstanding what the USA is doing, and that they need to just, come to their senses and reach an agreement, and that they need to stop any kind of Cold War from happening. It demonstrates that he's a liberal, that he's kind of a utopian. He doesn't really understand that the USA is an imperialist country, it has a reactionary government, they're not capable of carrying out any kind of progressive policy. But it also demonstrates that Edgar Snow was a lover of peace, he wasn't a reactionary. This book, Stalin Must Have Peace, it's not good. He has good intentions, his heart is in the right place, but the arguments he makes, they're just pandering to reactionary public opinion. They're pandering to reactionary US leaders. He's saying stuff like, well, the Soviets, they can't be aggressive because they're so weak. And, of course, they're not good, but, they're only being aggressive because they're weak and they're afraid and we're antagonizing them. Like, he's trying to make arguments that he thinks that reactionary politicians would accept. He's saying that actually the US could be more powerful if they changed their policy, but, it's not good. I don't recommend this one. It's not terrible, but it's just not good. There isn't really anything to be gained from it, in my opinion. As a result of his writings, Edgar Snow eventually started to be persecuted by McCarthy. So as a result, he wasn't really able to make a living. He couldn't get his books published or sold. And he eventually had to leave the US and move to Switzerland. So that's why there's an 11-year gap between his books now. He was super active in the 30s and 40s, like Far Eastern Front, 1933, Living China, 1936, Red Star over China, 1937, Scorched Earth, 1941, People on Our Side, 1944, Pattern of Soviet Power, 1945, Stalin Must Have Peace, 1947, 3 books in the 30s, 4 books in the 40s. So in 1957, he releases Random Notes on Red China, 1936 to 1945, but that's not new material that he's written. It's just basically more stuff from Red Star over China that some, mainly historians, I guess, wanted him to release. So he didn't write any new stuff, but he at least put that out after a 10-year period of not releasing any books. It's got some interesting stuff, like there's interviews of other communist leaders and whatnot. It's good, not really essential. The name really says it all. It's Random Notes on Red China. If you're interested in this stuff and if you already know about some of this stuff, then you'll get something out of it, but otherwise, probably not. After an 11-year period, Snow finally writes a new book, Journey to the Beginning, 1958, his autobiography. This one obviously tells his whole life story, how he wanted to study advertising, then he went to China, he went to Taiwan, wrote a bunch of articles for newspapers, wanted to be a travel writer, Japan invades Manchuria, he gets caught up in the politics of the Civil War, Chinese Revolution, and Second World War. He goes to India, he goes to Vietnam, he goes to USSR. This book, I learned some useful stuff from it, but I don't really recommend it. This is the first book that he has written after the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So this is the first book written after the Soviet Union became revisionist. And, well, Edgar Snow obviously is not a communist. So when Khrushchev makes up all the BS about Stalin and attacks Stalin as a monster or whatnot, Edgar Snow doesn't really doubt that. He accepts Khrushchev's interpretation. He also thinks that the split between Titoist Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union was because the Yugoslavs were too independent and the Soviets wanted to control them. That's a very typical sort of mainstream, dumb view of the situation. So from this point on, Snow's writing becomes even more mixed, in my opinion. Some of the stuff can still be good, but his understanding of quote-unquote Stalinism is just garbage. He's just hearing what Khrushchev is saying, and then he's just accepting it. And his understanding of Titoism is just garbage. Also, it becomes clear that Edgar Snow is not entirely reliable. Some of the stuff that he claims happened to him has been proven to be fictional. It's not really a big deal, but he's just clearly putting a little bit of flair into it. He wants to make things sound a bit more dramatic. Or he wants to say like, oh, I was in Vietnam when the independence movement was happening, or I was in Burma when the independence movement was happening. And that's not necessarily the case. He wasn't necessarily there. Or he says like, I was in India for more than 4 months, when in reality he was there for only 3 months. Like, it doesn't necessarily matter, but it just proves that he's not entirely reliable. And that's why I think when he starts to reframe stuff about the USSR, he starts to be a lot more critical of the USSR. He says that, oh, actually I was there and like Sherbakov was mean to me or something. Like, I was there and things were bad. And it's like, well, why didn't you say that at the time? Like, you published a book in 1947 and you republished another book in 1948 when the Cold War was already going on. You had every opportunity to criticize the USSR more, but you didn't. You're only doing it now, after the Khrushchev secret speech and after the rehabilitation of Tito. So it sounds more like you're just rewriting history so that you can be supposedly correct now, even though he's actually wrong about those things and not correct, but nonetheless. In 1962, he puts out a book called Russia, China, and the US, Changing Relations in a Changing World, which was also included in his next proper book called Red China Today, The Other Side of the River. And China, Russia, and the USA is crap. It's not good. It's not worth reading. It's short, and it's also included in Red China Today, so there's no reason to even get it, because you should just get Red China Today and you'll get it anyway. But I wish you didn't. I wish it was removed from Red China Today because it's crap. It has the same exact problems. It's talking about how Stalin was bad and how Titoism was because Tito wanted to be independent from like Soviet control, and it's just dumb. But his next proper book, Red China Today, The Other Side of the River, is actually very good. And my only criticism of that book is only the foreign policy stuff. Like, it's just the stuff that was also put out separately as China, Russia, and the USA. Like, that stuff is just bad. But other than that, it's great. So, he travels to China again after not being there for more than a decade. And he just travels around the country and sees what they're doing. It's during the industrialization, during the Great Leap Forward, during the collectivization of agriculture. He's seeing all the factories being built. He's seeing how everybody's being taught about modern industry and modern agriculture. He's talking about stuff that the party has done. Unfortunately, it's not a fully exhaustive history of the party or anything. But in this book, he's in his element again. He's seeing what's going on. He's talking about it. He's interviewing people. It's all super interesting. Highly recommended. When he talks about the USSR, it's stupid, but even though he no longer likes Stalin because of Khrushchev's attacks against Stalin, he also doesn't like Khrushchev anymore either, which is kind of ironic. So he still sides with China. He thinks that Khrushchev is kind of a bully and kind of a dumbass. He talks about the Sino-Soviet split, and he gets it mostly right, although he doesn't go into like the intricacies of it. But he says that it started out as a disagreement on tactics, how the Soviets wanted to do what they considered like peaceful coexistence and appeasement of the imperialists and stopping revolution, while China wanted to do the opposite, and that China initially started to criticize Yugoslavia and Yugoslav revisionism, but that was kind of their veiled way of criticizing Soviet revisionism. And although Edgar Snow doesn't really say this, that actually becomes more and more evident if you read those Chinese writings, because, for example, in the famous article, Is Yugoslavia a Socialist Country?, it explicitly says, Yugoslavia is revisionist, Yugoslavia has abandoned socialism, the Soviet Union should not follow the Yugoslav path, etc., etc. And then, of course, the Soviet Union does. So then, eventually, China criticizes the Soviet Union explicitly. Edgar Snow's commentary on the Great Leap Forward is okay. Obviously, there was the famine that happened in China in the early 60s, and Edgar Snow understands that it was basically because of natural catastrophes. But he also says that there were political mistakes, like bad execution of plans and bad execution of the policies. And I don't think he really had any great evidence to support such a view. I think he was getting that from Chinese rightists. Of course, it's not entirely wrong. Of course, there were mistakes and bad implementation of the plan, but I think he exaggerates a little bit. Then his last book, The Long Revolution, from 1972. Edgar Snow made a visit to China in 1970. He talks about the Cultural Revolution. He talks about the 9th Party Congress. It's all very interesting, recommended. But before he could finish the book, he died of pancreatic cancer. Zhou Enlai gave him a very nice tribute for his attempts to facilitate peaceful relations with China and friendship with the Chinese people. After Snow's death, the book was published by his wife. And now we only have one more to go. This is Edgar Snow's Journey South of the Clouds, edited by Robert Farnsworth, published in 1991. And this book is a little different. So this is about Edgar Snow's life. Robert Farnsworth had access to Edgar Snow's diary, Edgar Snow's archive, all his stuff. So he was able to verify various facts about his life, about the writing of his books. And this book actually contains articles that Edgar Snow wrote and published in a bunch of newspapers. Most of them are just sort of travel writing stuff, sort of Orientalist stuff. Not Orientalist in the sense that they're racist or anything, but it's just about, oh, look how exotic and interesting these countries are. So he's talking about weird stuff that's happened to him in China. Some of it is very political though, the Japanization of Formosa and some results of 35 years of Japanese rule in Formosa. I think those are good articles, they're worth reading. Formosa is Taiwan. He's talking about the Japanese colonial setup in Formosa and how they're trying to eliminate the national culture and just Japanize everybody. At the very end of the book, there's also another very interesting article called The Trial of British Communists at Meerut, India. That's another very interesting one. Not necessarily recommended. Most of it is not political. It's just about his travels. There's even a long article about the Taj Mahal and how cool it is. So it's not really very relevant to class struggle or something. But not a bad book. That's Edgar Snow. Those are his books. Those are my opinions. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.